Welcome everyone to our uh, wonderful walkthrough through the game Nobody Knows for Certain by Afrah Shafiq, made in collaboration and as a commission of the field research program at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art. Welcome, Afrah. So nice to be here with you today. I'm just going to do a really small introduction to the event today. And then Afra will talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty background of making this wonderful piece of gaming art. And we will walk through the game a little bit, not through the whole game because it's an immersive experience for, I think, several hours, but for the part of the game. And we will discuss the contexts and the visuals that we will see along the way. I'll be asking some questions of Afra because lots of stuff that she kind of dug out during this commission, very interesting, and I think will be a true revelation, even for people who are familiar with the Soviet publishing context of the 60s, 70s, and the 80s of the 20th century. But first, a couple of introductory words that are in order. My name is Valentin Diakonov. I'm one of the curators of this project, along with Yaroslav Volovod. Me and Yaroslav in 2018, we were visiting the Kochi Biennial in India, and there we happened on a wonderful installation by Afra called Sultana's Reality. It is also an immersive gaming experience based on a wonderful turn-of-the-century short story by Rokeya Hossein called Sultana's Dream. It is it's a wonderful utopian outline of a society that is ruled by women, a completely wonderful and unique piece of example of feminist and suffragist literature of the period. And what Afra did in her installation is she kind of grounded Sultana's Dream in the context of the actual history and the actual positions of women at the time, before and during the time when this short story was written. Thanks to Afra, we have been able to show this game, to make it available for our audience, the Garage audience. We also translated the original story into Russian, and it's still available on the Garage Museum website. So, and me and Yaroslav were so impressed by this work that we immediately met Afra in Kochi, and soon after we decided to do something together, and we invited her to be part of the field research program. This all happened at a very difficult time in the world globally. The time we started working, I think, a little bit before the COVID pandemic hit, a little bit before the lockdown, and this project wouldn't be possible if not for the field research team, if not for Oksana Polyakova, Daria Bobrenko, and Ivan Yerygin, who took it upon themselves to provide the bulk of the archival research, the bulk of the museum research for this game, working out the visuals, working out the intricacies of archival materials in Russia. And of course, Afra has been hard at work conversing with collectors in India who amassed holdings, really wonderfully vast holdings of children's literature, children's book that were translated in many languages of India during the 60s and the 70s. So we're very happy to present Nobody Knows for Certain. Afra, please take it away. Please tell us a little bit about how this project came together and what were the background processes of working on it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today, and I hope this turns out to be a fun session. And before we really get into playing the outcome of the research project, which is called Nobody Knows for Certain, I thought it might be interesting just for me to take very little time and just sort of set up the world from which this sort of came about. Just like Valentine said, it kind of began pre-COVID and through a garage field research fellowship where after much conversation and deliberation, I kind of remembered through a friend sometime like a few months before we ended up meeting in Kochi, a wonderful collection of children's story books that my friend had showed me that were all from the Soviet Union. And they had really stayed with me. And at that point, I had very little knowledge about the world that they came from, but I remember being very struck by the extremely distinct and rich illustrations in the storybooks, and also this very beautiful paper that they were printed on, this very kind of different from what I grew up reading. And since I was a child in the 90s, by which the Soviet Union no longer existed, I did have, a few books here and there that might have belonged to that time, but I missed the party by a generation. And I think that people who are now in their 40s really were born in or were children at a time in India where literature from the Soviet Union was a very big part of growing up in India. And I think that's what kind of interested me and fascinated me. And I started working on this research fellowship, just trying to understand for myself, like, what was this? What were these books? How did they get here? Who was reading them? What did they say? What did it mean, etc.? And I'm just going to show you a few images and kind of share a few of those findings in a second. So I kind of, I kind of started off from the internet, where I met, one second, let me just play this. Is this, is my like screen with the slideshow visible? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So I kind of started off by getting in touch with people who had these collections through these very active Facebook group called Fans of Russian Children's Books or Russian Children's Books in Marathi, etc. And they were just a lot of people who weren't collectors in the sense that we think of collectors in the art world, etc. But they were people who held other kinds of jobs or weren't like connected to research or publishing or art, but just grew up and loved these books and had maybe 2 boxes of them in their house, or somebody had more, and just were kind of attached to them, I think, more than anything else, through a sort of nostalgic connection to a world that they were children in. And then there were, of course, a few more collectors who, as I kind of got introduced to the sub community and people would kind of put me in touch with other people who had larger collections, etc., I just thought it might be a good idea to visit some of these larger collections and build an archive of the books by just photographing a selection from them. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that. So this is just 2 images to kind of show you at the time when the books would come to India, what it was like. This is in the late 50s. There's a Soviet book and periodicals showroom in Calcutta. And then the PPH bookstall, which is down here, the People's Publishing House, which this is at a fair in Bombay. And then this is one of the people whose collections I visited in Burari near Delhi. His name is Balram Sharma, and he done something called Kamgar Prakashan, or the Workers' Publication. And so his kind of relationship to Soviet literature comes very much from the Communist Party, who he was a member of and was kind of involved with communist publishing and not only children's literature. And so I was kind of looking at all of his books that he no longer, he still has the books available and people still buy children's books from him, but obviously since these books are not really in print anymore, they're limited copies. But he had some really rare books as well. Like this is one of the first collection of Lenin's writings in India, dated 1932, which is one of the first prints. And then this is a private collector, a person called Nikhil Rane, who lives in Bombay, but his collection in his parental house, his ancestral village in Ratnagiri. And it's really interesting. Nikhil's journey again to these books comes via his father, who worked in Bombay in the mills. He was part of the trade unions. He was part of the labor movement, and therefore he was interested in the ideas of that came to India from the Soviet Union in terms of communist publishing, you know. And then as a child, he gets introduced to these children's books because of his father's interest in these ideas and these movements. And so for him, even though that's the way in which the books entered his life, for him, it was just a very seminal part um, of his childhood. And we're also talking about an era where largely like there was no internet or telephone or I mean, radio was sparse. People didn't have TVs, so books really sort of became like the only outlet to connect to something outside of your immediate life. So I think that the impression that it left on the children of that generation was also so much more deeper than it might have been for today's generation in that sense. Um, so Nikhil has this like very deep sort of fondness for the characters and the places that he kind of grew up reading about, and he's he still sort of maintains this collection with a lot of pride, and is still like looking to expand it whenever he can, etc. These were a few more of the collections that I visited in different states. One is in Kerala, this is in Bombay, and some shots of how we went about archiving the books in the collection. And so early on in the research, I was just sort of interested in the books themselves, and kind of trying to photograph a healthy cross section of them, and then spend time with them after these research trips to just kind of read the books and do this very data analysis sort of exercise, like what were the books about, what did they tell me, etc., which I'll get into more when we're playing the game, but to show you just like a very aerial view of it. I think some of the categories that the books could kind of be slotted into were the fairy tales or the folk tales, which were the largest category, and then they came from all kinds. I mean, they weren't only Russian children's books, although that was what it was often called in India for convenience, but they came from all of the different Soviets and different sort of regions of that union. So the folk tales and the fairy tales was one. And then you had the science books and the space books. That was another big genre. A lot of books about the space race and space exploration, and, like latest, like how is electricity made, or what is this, so geology, or what are glasses, or like basically like books around science, technology, and space. Then there were these books that were quite um, plainly celebrating the greatness of the Soviet Union, this amazing land with these amazing ideas and how perfect and glorious everything is. So books about art tech, or about different sort of new industrial revolution related things, things around education, or things around a more egalitarian society, and sort of celebrating this land. And then books about Lenin was a very big genre, and often Lenin and his special relationship with children, with orphans, and how much he meant to the children in the Soviet Union was a common theme in the books around Lenin. Um, and then you have these sort of historical fiction books, which were just about like the revolution, about the Bolsheviks, about the Red Army versus the White Army, etc., which were kind of set in a very specific period of the birth of the Soviet Union. So this is the sort of like broad spectrum range of what I thought the books were kind of exploring. But over time, I also kind of got interested in some of the, like, what did all of this mean? And I think one keen observation that I ended up making after spending some time with the material was that to me, it felt like there was a sort of a tension in the books, or in the sources of the stories, of a tension between the magical and the rational, because you had so many folk and fairy tales, which were obviously full of magical elements and fantasy and unreal or unrealistic stories. And then you have this other kind of book that actually challenges magic, or you had this book that kind of isn't really celebrating magic as something that's of use and value to children. So this is, for example, just a small um, example of that. But this did show up in different ways and in different books. But this is an introduction to a book that says the time of magicians has passed, and there probably never were any to begin with. They must have been made up to fool very little children. And then, the story begins. And then this is also a poster that, we came across during the research, which kind of talks about letting go of a certain kind of story for the child and making room for another kind or a new story for a new kind of imagination. Um, and apart from this, I also wanted to kind of extend beyond the books to look at some material that might help me understand the world in which these books came to India. Um, and so I was kind of looking at, like, for example, a sticker which says Hindi Rusi Bhai Bhai, or a lot of these series of stamps that kind of commemorated the friendship between these two nations, etc. And I think it was around this time that I had also kind of begun to get a sense of my research in India and wanted to go to Moscow as part of the field research program. And COVID happens, and series of delays later, in comes the fabulous field research team from Garage, who have been stellar in every way. And they kind of really took over, leafing through so much material, and also to kind of help me navigate through a world that isn't familiar for me or isn't somewhere that I come from. And lots of different museums, archives, collections, sites, academic reading was kind of accessed by Oksana, Daya, and Ivan, and lots of back and forth. I'm going to show you a few of the things that I got from this end of the research in Russia. So we kind of wanted to photograph objects and materials that were very large in the imagination of children here in India, but also like came from via the stories, but also through other forms, right? And so obviously the Matryoshka doll is something that a lot of children in India, we continue to be familiar with, but have grown up with. And so this is a set that was photographed by the field research team during one of their visits. Um, I was also interested in letters. A lot of the books ended with write to us, like the publishers would invite the children to write to them, and the children wrote to them in large numbers. So we also accessed some of the letters that children wrote and what replies came into them and what were the kind of responses to the books at the time. Then I was also interested in the ways in which items and objects from the world that the books were written about made themselves visible in the books themselves, right? So I was looking very much at these sort of ritual towers or the red and white embroidery patterns that repeatedly make themselves present in the illustrations in the book. And then I was kind of curious to explore that form, which is also a sort of predecessor form of storytelling. And so a lot of material of this sort was then looked at from the archives that weren't necessarily books, but held within them stories, and then they themselves were present in the books in some way. We also looked at a lot of lacquer miniatures, which again is, a form of storytelling within storytelling, and millions of narratives existing in the same space. And often a lot of the characters from the fairy tales or otherwise that I'd read would feature in these boxes. So that was also part of that research. And there's lots more to say about the research, but I'm going to actually just stop here and get into the game, and then maybe we can kind of see how all of this comes together. Okay, so I'm going to just share the game, and I'm going to stop talking in the middle if I want to say anything, but otherwise I'm just going to play and hopefully enjoy watching me play. So this is really the map of stories that you land into when you're in the game. And I think the inspiration for this sort of map of stories comes from one of Pushkin's writings, which talks about Lukumorye. And here you have Pushkin, and if you click on him, he tells you, beside the sea stands a green oak tree, and on the tree a golden chain, and on the chain a learned cat walks round and round and round again. When he goes left, he tells a tale, and when he goes right, he sings a refrain. And so, really looking at this kind of map of endless stories, which you can zoom through, move about, and click on different things that will lead you to tiny little micro stories here and there. I'm going to show you a few of them. So some of them, for example, are familiar stories and characters that you might already know, like you click on this little frog, and it's the story of the Frog Queen. So she says, I was born wiser and cleverer than my father. This so angered him that he turned me into a frog, and a frog I shall be for 3 years. And so you have these tiny sort of pop-up boxes that tell you different stories in this map. But the other thing that happens in this map and through the game are these collectible cards. So for instance, if I click on these three gentlemen here in the center, you see that you found your first card. It's an info card. And through the game, you have these cards that are littered through, which will have sort of a title and a number on them. And if you're interested in what you think they're going to say, you can flip them over and read them. And then they become part of what you collect as a player, and it's in your sort of collection box in the game. So for example, the reason I wanted to open this card is also to talk about the lacquer miniature painting, which is the style in which this map is made of, where I've kind of looked at hundreds of different images from different boxes from the archives that the field research team photographed as part of this project, and then made this map, but also looking at the history of this sort of way in which this lacquer miniature painting is linked to icon paintings and the ways in which they turned to painting fairy tale characters when it wasn't, the right atmosphere to paint icons and religious characters at that time. And so how this sort of one restriction kind of creates a richness of another form that you see kind of developing through the work in different ways. Yeah. And then, so the cards are one of the kinds of things you can collect in the map. And then the other kind of thing that you can collect in the map are storybooks. So before I show you storybook, I want to actually show you some few interesting things in this map. So right here on the corner, you will see Lenin with a group of Indians. And it's in one of the lacquer miniature boxes. You actually see this, and it's called Lenin Goes to India, which is quite funny. And then when you click on this, you see a book about Fancy Niketin's the first voyage that was made from that part of the world to India, and that's 1466. And so these are the different books that have been archived through the field research trip, and you can kind of read the entire book. And then just like the cards, they become part of your collection. So for example, when you hit the escape menu, you have one icon that says books. And here, the book that we just collected is here. And every book that you collect is, in your book collection box. And similarly with your cards, the one that we collected is here, but then there are all of these other cards that you can collect in the map. And apart from these, micro little dialogue boxes and cards and books that are hidden in all of these different parts of the maps, you will also sometimes encounter a locked story. And these are sort of original stories that I've ended up adding to the sea of stories. They're stories of my own, but I think that the quest of the game is to unlock all of these stories till you're able to access all of them. So when you begin the game, you might come across various locked stories, and only one, which is the very first story, is unlocked. But as you move through, you end up unlocking them in a sequential order. So I'm just going to start with the first story. So for the sake of this playthrough, I'm not really collecting cards, but this is, you can kind of, the player kind of navigates back and forth. The pace of the story stops to read what they like. Cards are everywhere. You've already reached number 7. But I'm just going to stick to the baseline story, but the game is online, so I encourage you to spend your own time with it afterwards and treat this just as an opening teaser. and that's really the beginning of the stories. I just want to take a moment here to just say a little bit about the title of the game, which is the opening of a folk tale called The Magic Flute, which is a Belarusian folk tale. And what I really loved about it is this ambiguity or this non-committalness of the statement, you know. And I felt like it was really like a perfect way that encapsulated what I was trying to do with this game, where I'm really taking a lot of liberty to mix in fantasy and fiction and documentary and findings from the research, but also speculation, stories from the books, but also alterations to those stories, etc. And I feel like one of the other things that I'm trying to do through this project is also look at the spine of the story itself, and what does the story mean? How is the story itself constructed? And then how does that transform and morph or reframe itself as it travels? And so there are these two cards here that I just want to kind of share in that light. This is a card about transformation. Um, and so this card, or the fairy tale, or the wonder tale as it's called, one of the key kind of by folklorists who kind of study these tales, one of the key founding for qualities of this tale is the idea of transformation or metamorphosis, where it's not only that it is a theme in the stories often where characters transform, but also the tale itself is incapable of transformation. And so you see the tale as it goes through time, adapting, holding on to its same structure and spine, but kind of adapting in response to the worlds in which it travels or it lives in. And I find that kind of fascinating thing about this act of storytelling itself that I'm kind of trying to revisit in different ways in the game. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead now and move through the rest of it. So here's where you have your instructions, and you can read a little bit about the game. We also have a very extensive bibliography if you're kind of interested in more research. But we're just going to go ahead into the game right now. So in the research, a lot of the things that came up, which I found quite special in terms of this period or this time in which the books came in. It's not only the fact that the books were, I mean, first of all, they were available in almost every Indian language. They were available in about 13 Indian languages. But also that they weren't centered only in, large cities or metros, but they really kind of found a very wide distribution network. And people would often recount that there would be a traveling or a mobile van that would come to their little district or their little city or village or whatever. And they'd know, okay, on the fourth Tuesday of the month, this van comes here or whatever. So there was a whole traveling schedule. And I kind of wanted to pay ode to that came up in the research. Every state in India had a different publisher or a book center that was kind of in charge of distributing the stolen books for that state. So this van will go on a much longer journey that you can follow it through. But you can also read all of these books in the van. And I'm just going to show you a few of the really special ones, but you can kind of go ahead and look at more in your own time. So this is, I think, the oldest book that I found through my research. It's Tolstoy's Kitten in Marathi, and it dates 1958. And this is an interesting book because it was quite early, so they didn't actually create a special copy for every language edition, but it was the original Russian edition with sticker, like separate text paper labels stuck on top of them in Marathi. So you would also see the original language here, and then this was a small, like extra space given to the book with the Marathi translation below, but it wasn't redesigning the book for that language. And you see this only up to like maybe the 60s at the latest. But the later books, there's a lot of attention given to creating new design and typefaces for the different languages in which the books came. Anyway, you have these gorgeous illustrations with this very sweet story by Tolstoy in Marathi, which I really love. And then this book, in contrast, if you look at, is a much later book where you have the type is also redesigned in Gurumukhi. This is for the audience in Punjab. So it's a Gurumukhi book, which is again quite a rare language book. And in my conversation with a PhD scholar, Jessica Bachman, who's kind of doing her PhD on Soviet publishing for the Indian audience, she actually shared with me that the first Gurumukhi typeset was actually made in Moscow and not in India. And like in Moscow is one of the first places where printing in this language even happened. So in parallel to these books getting made, there was also like innovation and advancement in printing in all of these languages that didn't always exist at the time. So this is the Three Bears and Gurumukhi. And then there are lots of books about the Firebird. This is one of my, I love the illustrations by Philippine in this book, and it's a series of 6 books. And you will see a lot of these images were used in the first chapter, the prologue that we just saw. Which are just the most special, intricate borders and detailed decorative motifs and all of these different parts, every character, windows of very houses, like a lots of detailing in these books. That was actually a very novel form for the children's book illustration also at the time. Whereas this was considered also a rare book because it was a die cut book where the book is in shape of the color book or the round one. Which again became quite a rage among young children. The other thing that was quite special is that not only were these books so, widely distributed and the fact that they came in all of these Indian languages, but they were also extremely affordable. So people would often say, I don't know how much proof there is to it, but there was hearsay that the cost of the book would be less than the cost of the postage stamp that it came in. So it was just short of distributing it for free, which also, and yet the quality of the books were amazing. So it kind of became very easily accessible to large audiences of children who might not have otherwise been able to afford other children's books that were in the market at that time. So yeah, this is sort of a scene where you can spend more time with the book, use it learning kids going across the country. And I think we're ready to leave and move to the next part of the story. Which is here. The Tale of the Cat Without a Tail. I'm just gonna enter. And I think this is the more fun level that's a little bit more traditional explorer game style, which is more fun if you play, but you have your arrow keys, you have the character of this cat that you can kind of make walk around and meet different people, hit X to interact with them. And I'm just going to do it on your behalf. just to like share a little background information about this level. This is basically based on the Lubbock prints, which are also, I would say, kind of a predecessor to, hold on, let me look at this one. A predecessor to storybooks or the illustrations of storybooks. And so I was really looking at, uh, the ways in which the illustration style of the Lubbock then influences the ways in which children's books illustrations draw from or create from. And so this chapter is told in the style of different Lubbock prints that were made accessible to me through the Garage field research trip, but also were a very big influence by Ivan Bilbin himself when he kind of started making his children's book illustrations. Um, and the other thing in a lot of the Lubbock illustrations you see is that cats feature very strongly in those prints. And often cats are used as a way to talk about characters and people that might not be easy to talk about by naming them directly, which you'll see as you go. But some iconic Lubbock is, the mice bearing the cat, or the cat of Kazan. And so I thought it would be interesting to use the character of the cat in the form of the Lubbock and then create this new story of the cat without the tail. And now we've kind of reached the next scene um, in the game. And I guess part of the logic with which the game is built is, like a river has multiple streams, so do stories. There are all of these different side things that can open out depending on what you click. So for example, if you click on this little girl, she tells you about how she comes here to buy these books and she invites you into her house, which we're not going to go into right now, and say maybe some other time. But there's a whole little, side story that you can go to and explore the world that she comes from. But you also have these, like I had through conversations with one of the collectors, I remember him telling me distinctly that he loved to look at the pictures of the books that had snow in them because it was such an alien thing and he'd never seen snow in real life. And so then I kind of wanted to, weave that into the story as well. So there are all of these different experiences of the different children and why they held on to these books or what they really liked about them that I've kind of tried to weave into the scene and really make it about the readers. There's another cool thing that in this book. So this is kind of the shopkeeper's catalog, but this is also a kind of an unusual catalog that I found through the research, where you see the list of what were the different books that came to India, not only children's literature, but all of the other books that were available in India that you could order. And kind of gives you an interesting cross section of the larger imagination within which these children's books were, a part. And there are also all of these, little reports of book sales and conferences and exhibitions around books that happen quite regularly in India. So you kind of see this very rich and active kind of ecosystem within which these readers that you see in this scene existed. And here again, you have a little mini challenge, which is kind of in the genre of what's called hidden object games. So you're supposed to find in the scene 5 aspects of Indo-Soviet friendship so that you can proceed to the next level. Valentin, do you want to help me? Do you want to suggest what these 5 items could be? Apart from the books, of course. Um, any suggestions? I can click on whatever you want to click on.
There's a Lenin monument. Yes, I remember I collected that one.
There you go. Lenin statues in India. And then you kind of read about, the history of those Lenin statues. It's quite fascinating. I mean, I could only give like a small snippet of it in these cards, but each of these objects have their own, stories in themselves. Um, I'll go for one. This is a poster of a of a Bollywood film that was very iconic in the Soviet Union called Mera Naam Joker. And and I think that um, you know, a lot of the Bollywood films produced in the 50s and 60s had a lot of themes that were also kind of a lot of films were shot in the Soviet Union. The market of the Soviet Union was also an active audience in the minds of producers that they made these films, especially all the Raj Kapoor films, where the everyday working class man was the hero in the film, for example. Um, then you have the sticker that I mentioned earlier that I found through some of the paraphernalia of the collectors. This is interestingly a slogan, like a political slogan that was initially advocated through a visit that Khrushchev did to India in 1959. Um, then you have something that a lot of people in India remember very clearly.
Radio Master. आप प्रस्तुत हैं हमारा हिंदी चैनल
And Radio Moscow was available also in um, a lot of local Indian languages, which made it even more sort of closer to people across the country. This is the scene with all of these different stamps that were kind of issued in to commemorate Indo-Soviet friendship. And now you're in a new story again. And just gonna mute so I can say a little bit about this story. So this story is actually inspired by one of the collectors that I met. His name is Devadatta. And he was obsessed with the space books. And I just really wanted to think about a character of a young child who was obsessed with because that genre was also so distinct and significant, but also left like a very strong impression in the minds of the kids who read them. Because I mean, of course, it was a very exciting time globally when the first kind of movements into space were happening, and it really felt like a whole new world was opening out, etc. But also, a lot of the books that came from the Soviet Union were written by cosmonauts directly to the children. And so I think that made that experience of going out to outer space less sort of a factual and historical experience and more a personal experience. So Devadatta kind of recounts the book that left a very strong impression in his mind called The Sun's Wind, which was written by Alexei Leonov about the Soyuz Apollo mission. And he writes directly addressing the child, like, I write this book for you. This is what I think your kind of role in this universe is. And this is how I kind of understand it, having traveled to this out of this earth dimension. And it's quite moving, it's quite touching. And it's also interesting because while obviously a lot of the books of the space race were trying to kind of foreground the Soviet achievements in comparison to where the USA was in the space race simultaneously, there were a lot of books that were also looking at space as a new domain of a possible new friendship between nations, where you didn't have to carry over this kind of burdens of what the political sort of fragmentation on Earth was. And so I think that a lot of those books also reflected a sense of a restart or a hope in some way. So anyway, in this scene, you will find only books from the space theme. So, for example, this is a book on the first cosmonaut. Yuri Gagarin. It's actually also quite a lovely story. And then you have all of these other books about like, geology, which is gorgeously illustrated, this book. And so kind of bringing this sense of like fantasy and magic into science through the space genre was a lot more possible, I feel. This is the book about, I chose to include this book in Marathi in the game because that's the language in which Devadatta read this book when he was growing up. But this is a book about Alexei, there he is. But what you can do in this chapter with our little cat hiding in the bag is that you have to help this boy finish his scrapbook. And only then you can kind of proceed in the game. So there's again this like challenge here. So you kind of, I've kind of made this fictional scrapbook made by this child by cutting together all of the different parts of the existing around space. And so you have all of these little scraps, like you might want to put this, so you just, do a little master following game to help this get complete, like this little button here. Etc. There's a cheat code to get past this book, which I'm gonna use right now. I don't have to solve the whole thing. But it's a fun puzzle. You might think it's easy, but yeah, this is what the book looks like. I'm just gonna hit the cheat code to solve it.
Greetings from India to you all. We saw the launching of your spacecraft with fascination. We share your excitement. Yours is a historic endeavor. I hope it will make our country space conscious and inspire our young people to be more adventurous. हमारे देशवासी, हमारा पार्लियामेंट और व्यक्तिगत रूप से मैं आप और आपके सह अंतरिक्ष यात्रियों कर्नल यूरी मालेशेव और श्री गेनाडी स्ट्रेकलोव की सफलता और सुरक्षित वापसी की प्रार्थना करते हैं। आप सबको मेरी शुभकामनाएं। जय हिंद।
पहले तो मैं भारत के नागरिक होने के नाते आपको धन्यवाद देता हूँ और मेरे क्रू मेंबर्स भी मेरे साथ आपको धन्यवाद देते हैं आपकी बधाई के लिए। तबीयत बिल्कुल ही अच्छी है, ज़रूरत से ज़्यादा खा रहे हैं हम।
ऊपर से भारत कैसा दिखता है आपको?
जी मैं बगैर किसी झिझक के कह सकता हूँ कि सारे जहां से अच्छा।
आपकी उड़ान भारत और सोवियत संघ के बीच मैत्री की एक सुंदर मिसाल है। इस क्षेत्र में सोवियत संघ के
Just like a quick translate, that's an iconic interview by the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi with Rakesh Sharma when he was on the Soviet space mission. He was the first Indian to go to outer space. And in this interview, I mean, it's iconic for various reasons, but she kind of, talks to him about his experience in outer space, and the whole tone of the interview is very much celebrating this moment as an important moment in the friendship between India and the Soviet Union. And it's interesting because somebody recently told me when they saw this that the first Lebanese person to go out of state, into space was also through the Soviet Union. And there's a very similar format interview done by the Prime Minister of Lebanon with their cosmonauts. So it also seems to be like part of larger formats that, might have been parallelly constructed to build this sort of international, like inter-nation friendship connected to the space race. But in this game, since we're in the world of children, this child is sort of lost in his space dream. And we can continue our story to our main character, the cat. So again, you can kind of move around the room, try and find and exit. And I think the The story continues, but I'm thinking maybe I stop here. And yeah, I can let you explore how it ends, even if the story actually ends. When you play the game yourself. It's on the Garage Digital website in for Mac and Windows and in Russian and in English. So yeah, you can feel free to download and play.
Thank you, Afra. Thank you for this walkthrough. Yes, and we welcome everyone to try it out. We have the Russian and English version for both the most popular computer systems on our website. So feel free to browse through many of the books that were not part of this presentation here, and feel free to collect cards. I think we'll open up our meeting for questions. Right now, you can leave them in the chat in any language that you feel like. I have a couple of questions for you, Afra. Actually, most of the questions that I had before, I think you've answered those during your presentation today. But I was wondering, just, if you know that, for example, if there were any comparable efforts comparable publishing efforts in India in this era from the opposing side of the Cold War, maybe, American or British sponsored books and, series that could be a kind of petition for the Soviet effort in this regard?
I mean, I think often the Reader's Digest is compared to the Soviet Nari. They're both looked at as two opposing, but very similar genre publications. But the thing with the Reader's Digest or even other literature from America was that it was not cheap. And so it was also only in English. There wasn't an effort to translate in this way. And so it didn't really, it was very confined to urban, upwardly mobile, middle class, and onward populations. The Reader's Digest would not be read in Telugu or in Tamil or in other languages like this. And similarly with children's books in particular, I think by the time I grew up, actually, I was reading, Enid Blyton's and like Sweet Valley when I was a teenager. A lot of American high school Archie's comics, this sort of thing, which were easily available via lending libraries, but again, all English. And so therefore, I think that it's not so easy to compare because the audiences for these books were so much vaster just because of the translation effort that was part of their distribution, strategy in some way.
Another thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but browsing through the game before our meeting, I have a feeling that a lot of books that deal with the 20th century history of the USSR and with a kind of a propagandistic effort, books about our tech, for example, or books about Lenin, or books about the earlier history of the revolution, they're mostly in English, and there was no effort to translate them into Indian languages? Or are there other Marathi or Malayalam versions of books about Lenin?
Yes, definitely. I mean, see, the game is a limited sphere, and I did want people to be able to, largely my audience will be an English speaking audience or an English reading audience. And so I did want to strategically include books that I felt were important to read to understand what ideas were being kind of propagated to be in English, but definitely all of the books were in all of the languages. In fact, most of the political books for sure will be in Bengali and Malayalam because that's where the largest sort of audience of people who were more kind of linked to the communist movement were. But even in Hindi or in other languages, it wasn't as if one kind of book was translated more than the other. It was quite even. Yeah.
Can you also, you mentioned when you were talking about the collectors in the first part of your presentation, you mentioned that some of them have a family history of, for example, parents who were leftist, who were part of labor unions, who were part of a effort of like modernizing communist effort in India. Do you think is the case for most of the collectors of the Soviet books, that they had some sympathies for the Soviet Union as a, political entity?
I mean, I think it's difficult. I don't think so. There are two parts to this actually. For the readers, no. I don't think that the readers of the books when they were children were necessarily linked to the party in any way or to ideas of the communist movement or aligned to the left at all. I think that the readers were a much larger cross section. Um, as adults, to still have an affinity to those books, yes, often those people are left leaning, but not always. Again, but I don't think that the people who still like appreciate and love those books are necessarily only like people who are left leaning or who have sort of a relationship with the Communist Party. Because I was archiving people who had the largest collections of books, so that it's easier for me to build the archive. Therefore, it was people who managed to have that large connection because they were somehow connected to something, but not. I don't think that that's at all the case. And I don't. But I do think that having grown up loving and reading these books, often in conversations with people who are now adults, they may not at all sort of identify as communist, but there is a sort of spirit of or an imagination of a country that is ideal that aligns with this idea of sort of I wouldn't call it a communist idea, but this idea of like not monarchy and not capitalism, but a world where there is a lot more of an even distribution, open access to education, opportunity, etc. Like I feel like this is a lot of the affinity that or the attraction of those ideas that people still hold in some way. Yeah.
I'm also very curious about the form of the quest. You mentioned often that you were a teenager in the 90s, and this is
Yeah.
such a game form that like is connected for me is connected to early gaming, the very early
Yes.
game examples that I was familiar with when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s. Why do you choose, well, time and time again, why do you choose this form? And why do you think it's the best for the topics that you take on?
I mean, honestly, although I have worked in this form before, when I was started working on this project, I didn't set out to make this. I thought I would just do the research and see where that takes me. And I felt like for the children who are good, I mean, for two reasons, I think that this is the form that I ended up choosing. For me, as a child, I grew up with these sort of multimedia CD-ROMs, which were like, part game, but part story and very quest-like. And you click on this and then this happens, or you go here and this happens, or whatever. And for me, that was a magical world. That was like, that blew my mind as a child. And I think that the ways in which the readers of today would describe their experience with these books coming from this faraway land that were absolutely magical. And I felt like there were parallels in those experiences or the feeling towards those forms, because it was as new to have this full color, die-cut shape book about this country so far away, but in your language. Like how amazing, how magical that was, And so I felt like there was a parallel of experience, but also I really liked this form because of the way that it allows for simultaneity. And that's something I'm really interested in my work, because I feel like something about something about telling a story in a linear way for me feels like, but that's not how I want to say it, because it's also this and that, while this, but that. And so I feel this form really allows for all of those multiple pathways and streamways to like parallelly exist, and so I kind of keep coming back to that. But also the other thing is I wanted to build an archive of these books, and so then the game becomes like a host for the archive, or like a world for the books to live in. And what better way, like what better world than a world of stories, in a sense. Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to welcome the questions. Please send your questions to the chat. And yeah, like I said, any language that you want to use, we will translate. I think we have a lot of We have a lot of enthusiasm in the chat, but no questions yet. I think people are going to check the game out, and then they will have a chance. Yeah, we have a question. What software did you use to make the game?
It was made in Unity. I also want to, yeah, it was made in Unity, but I used the Adobe suite to do the animations and the design, etc. I also want to take a moment to actually say that this game was also made by a team of people who were just fabulous at work. We worked together for over a year, and so there was a programmer whose name was Kushal, who did all the programming end of the gameplay and the visuals in Unity. We had a sound programmer who worked on the sound aspects of it, and I think that the sound has come together in quite a beautifully responsive way, whose name is Horatio. All the music in the game is original music that's composed by Rushad Mistry and Zora and Miranda. Rushad's actually here in this call, so you can share music compliments with him. And he spent a lot of time actually like studying, folk instruments and like thinking through the music in quite beautiful and immersive ways. I had an animator who worked on it, lots of support from lots of people. And so, yeah, just want to also like explain the process of making it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was another question that we have? Another question that we have is, do you have any plans to, do you have any projects, any gaming projects in the future?
Yeah, actually,
are you working on another game?
Yes, two. Actually, I think it's a long time now. Good. I feel like this is definitely not like a stop to making James' journey, but this particular game you will see ends at part 1, and there's a part 2 to the story that's already like scripted, and the cat and doll's journey continues, and it's very much my intention to work on part 2 of the very same story in the same world where the cat and the doll travel to Russia. And then let's see what happens there. But yeah, apart from that, I've made another game after this one called Where Do the Ants Go, which was completed at the end of last year, and a few more game ideas in progress. Yeah.
Another question is, what was the most complex part of this project, of making this game?
Yeah. In terms of the production on the making, I'm not gonna. There were lots of things in the research and getting the archival material that was also difficult. But in the production process, I think for me, since it was although I have worked in sort of interactive formats before, I haven't worked in a game engine before. Everything that I worked on before this was on HTML or on a web page logic. And so this was a game engine. So it was a very steep learning curve, also because there are certain things that I think a game engine is designed to do that I was interested in doing other things, because it's not a very traditional looking game. It's more, some parts I wanted it to be a video, but then some parts I wanted you to be able to control the pace, but you can also like go here or go there or whatever. So I didn't actually build any of the animations or the movements and interactions in the game engine. So you'd have to build them in a different software, like in Adobe After Effects, or Premiere Pro, whatever. Then you had to kind of export each element as a separate layer, and then you had to restack the whole thing inside the game engine. So it was really, for me, it was frustrating, and it felt like double the work, because I was down. I could see the work on my screen, but it would take almost the same amount of time that took me to make the work to just put that thing inside the game engine and get it to then respond to a particular way, So I feel like that's been a big learning for me in this process, and felt also the most difficult, just formats and technical stuff, Yeah.
Well, a question from our dear friend Cynthia Tolles from Houston here. Is there a unified digitized archive of these books available, or is your game actually the principal source of information, digitized
No, no,
information
no.
on things?
Well, I wouldn't claim that at all. Actually, there's no formalized archive at all. There are individual collectors who have been have been photographing and archiving their own collections, but largely their collections are language specific. So
Mhm.
there is a blog for Soviet books in Bengali that I think is very extensive, and they have probably most of the titles that were ever published, but they're only in Bengali. And then similarly, there are other sort of, like there is on the Internet Archive website, there's a person who's donated their entire collection to be read for free. And so all of these efforts also come from making these books accessible to young children today to be able to read them. So they're not actually like museum or archive quality um, kind of initiatives. And my game is actually a cross section. It's not an extensive archive. It's sort of like a preview. There are hundreds and hundreds of titles that haven't made it into my game, so I don't think it qualifies as an archive either. But yeah, there hasn't been like one consolidated effort. And from what I understand from the Garage Field research team, there isn't an archive of the Indian languages books that existed anywhere in Moscow or elsewhere either. Yeah, so it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, another question. I think it will be the last question of our meeting, as we spent quite a lot of time here. What particular gaming experiences were an influence for you? And our reader says that this game is a bit like the game that is called "The Sea Will Claim Everything." Do you know this game, "The Sea Will Claim Everything"?
No, I actually don't know this game, but I've
We will
heard
check
it.
this out, because I
Yeah,
don't
we're
think
gonna look this
we
up.
have to check this game out. But what kind of gaming experiences were an influence for you? What do you
Um,
play? Do you play anything?
I do play games, but I mean, I like playing narrative games, and I kind of like playing more experiential, not like winning games and fighting combat, like this sort of thing. But I think that, well, The Cat and the Coup is an amazing game that also kind of, opened my sort of imagination to the game form. It's fantastic, sort of part historical and part came about Iran and CIA's kind of relationship. And um, there, there's this game called Beeswax that I love. It's just this little like paper character that kind of moves around this large village talking to people, and just the conversations are amazing. So I'm just hooked into that world. But yeah, I think I like a lot of atmospheric and like slow play games. But having said that, one of my favorite games, which I think is a very universally favorite game, and only much later I realized it was a Soviet game, is Tetris. Which is not like this game at all, and I don't think it's an influence, but it is something that I wanted to include in my game because I feel it's amazing. It was in the same sort of period, and I do think I'm going to kind of do something with Tetris. There was also like there's an intention to include it into part 2 of the game, or part 2 of Nobody Knows for Certain. But yeah, I think it's one of the most iconic games that I've ever been.
Yes, that's true. There's a movie, I think, a recent movie about
Yeah, I
Tetris.
haven't watched it though, but yeah, I've heard.
A Hollywood movie about the Soviet origins and the American exploitation of Tetris.
Yeah.
I've heard it's good. I've heard it's quite a good movie. Okay. Thank you everyone for being with us here. Thank you, Afra, for taking us through the game. Please do play it in any language in one of or both languages that we have it on. And thank you, Afra, very much. And we're waiting for the second part. I hope that we will get to play the second part of the game too at some point.
I hope so too. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.